What if one of the most important lessons of this war is not about missiles, warships, or speeches at all? What if the real lesson is that the modern economy still comes down to something brutally simple: physical buildings, physical cables, physical power, and physical machines that can still be damaged by a relatively cheap weapon? Read that again. The cloud is still physical, and this week, that reality came into focus when public reporting said Amazon Web Services facilities in the Gulf were hit or damaged during Iranian drone attacks, while AWS itself reported ongoing service disruptions in its Middle East regions and advised affected customers to consider alternate regions. That is the story here, not a movie scene, not a metaphor. A hard reminder that the digital world people imagine as weightless, borderless, and indestructible still lives inside real structures on real land in real conflict zones. And when those structures are disrupted, the shock does not stay local for long. It moves through businesses, governments, logistics systems, communication tools, media platforms, enterprise software, and every company that assumes the internet is somehow floating above geopolitics. It is not. It never was. And that is why this matters so much more than one headline about one drone strike. Because what got exposed here is not just the vulnerability of a few facilities. What got exposed is the vulnerability of a system people have spent years describing as resilient by default. Resilient does not mean invulnerable. Redundant does not mean untouchable. Distributed does not mean immune to geography. A cloud region is still a cluster of physical sites. Availability zones are still buildings in a place. Backup power is still power equipment. Fire suppression is still a physical response to physical danger. If that sounds obvious, good. It should. But the way most people talk about technology, you would think data lives in the sky and services recover by magic. This week shattered that illusion. According to public reporting, 2 AWS facilities in the United Arab Emirates were directly struck, while a facility in Bahrain was damaged by a nearby drone impact. AWS said the strikes caused structural damage, power disruption, and in some cases water damage linked to fire suppression. The company also reported increased connectivity issues and API error rates in the Middle East UAE region, and historical AWS health updates showed disruption affecting both the UAE and Bahrain regions. Not global collapse, not the internet going dark, but localized disruption serious enough that AWS recommended customers consider alternate regions and reroute traffic where appropriate. That distinction matters, because this is exactly where serious analysis begins and panic ends. The takeaway is not that the entire cloud failed. The takeaway is that physical disruption to cloud infrastructure can absolutely create meaningful service problems, especially when multiple facilities inside a region are affected at the same time. That is not clickbait. That is not hype. That is the mechanism. And once you understand that mechanism, the entire story changes. Because a modern data center is not just a warehouse full of computers. It is power conditioning, cooling, networking, fiber connectivity, fire controls, physical security, backup systems, and carefully designed separation between sites. AWS publicly says every region consists of multiple physically separate availability zones, with each region designed for resilience. That architecture is exactly why this did not become a worldwide digital blackout. The design worked well enough to prevent a worst-case outcome. But the same public reporting also makes clear that resilience has limits when the damage is physical and concentrated in a live conflict environment. That is the uncomfortable middle ground people often ignore. Systems can be well-designed and still vulnerable. Redundancy can reduce damage without erasing it. Engineering can buy time, reduce blast radius, and preserve continuity. But engineering is not a force field. Now zoom out one step further. This did not happen in a vacuum. It happened during a wider regional conflict that also pushed energy markets higher, disrupted transport patterns, and rattled governments across the Middle East and beyond. NBC reported that U.S. crude briefly rose above $82 a barrel and was up roughly 20% since Sunday. NBC also reported that tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz collapsed from more than 50 tankers 3 days earlier to just 2 on Monday. That is not background noise. That is the environment in which these data center disruptions happened. And this is where the story becomes bigger than technology. Because data infrastructure and energy infrastructure are not separate worlds anymore. They are now joined at the hip. Data centers run on power. Cooling depends on stable utility systems. Cross-border business continuity depends on shipping, energy prices, air travel, insurance, and regional stability. When oil spikes, shipping slows, airspace becomes uncertain, and security conditions tighten, the data economy does not sit above that storm. It gets dragged into it. That is why one of the most important parts of this story is not the damage itself. It is the timing. These strikes hit at a moment when public reporting already showed the region under severe stress. Drone interceptions in Qatar, rising threat levels, disrupted flights, suspended embassy operations, stranded civilians, and a broader sense that multiple systems were being tested at once. In that environment, a hit on digital infrastructure is not just a tech incident. It becomes part of a wider pressure campaign on confidence. Confidence in movement, confidence in energy, confidence in business continuity, confidence in the idea that critical infrastructure in the Gulf can keep operating normally while war expands around it. That confidence is worth more than most people realize, because modern economies run on assumptions as much as assets. Companies assume they can process transactions, route data, run logistics software, host customer applications, maintain communications, and keep regional workloads near users for latency, compliance, and business reasons. Cloud regions make those assumptions easier to operationalize, but the second a region becomes associated with live kinetic risk, those assumptions start getting repriced. And that repricing is not theoretical. It begins with technical teams asking hard questions. Do we need to fail over more aggressively? Are our backups actually region diverse, or do we only think they are? Do we have a tested recovery path outside the Gulf? Which workloads must remain local for regulatory reasons, and which can move immediately? How much latency are we willing to accept in exchange for stability? Which vendors depend on the same region we use? Which customers assumed multi-AZ meant crisis-proof? Which board members thought cloud risk was mostly cyber and not physical? Then it moves to executives. What does this do to our risk model? What does it do to insurance? What does it do to customer commitments? What does it do to service level agreements, contract language, and investor messaging? How exposed are we to a disruption that is not caused by software failure or operator error, but by war? And then it moves to governments. If cloud infrastructure in a strategic region can be physically disrupted, how do you think about digital sovereignty? About local hosting requirements? About whether essential public services should rely on infrastructure in an active conflict corridor? About how many regions are enough? About whether regional presence is still a straightforward strategic advantage when the region itself is under attack? This is why the real story is not a simple one-liner about a drone versus a data center. The real story is that a low-cost, one-way attack system can force expensive, highly advanced, globally integrated infrastructure into a defensive posture. That is, the pattern modern warfare keeps revealing again and again. Lower-cost offensive tools do not need to destroy everything to create strategic effects. They only need to inject enough uncertainty into enough critical systems at the same time. And uncertainty is expensive. You can see it in oil. You can see it in shipping. You can see it in air travel. You can see it in emergency evacuations. You can see it in the way cloud customers suddenly start looking at geography again. For years, the dominant digital story was abstraction. Abstract the server. Abstract the network. Abstract the storage layer. Abstract the hardware. Abstract the location. Let software handle the complexity. And to be fair, that model delivered enormous benefits. But abstraction can hide dependency. A crisis has a way of stripping abstraction away. In a real emergency, the old truths return fast. Where is the building? Where's the power coming from? Where's the fiber? How close are the sites? What are the transport links? How fast can staff move? What happens if local authorities restrict movement? What happens if the risk is not a cyber attack, but a drone, missile, blackout, or physical access constraint? That is the level this story operates on. Not fantasy, not the cloud is dead, not technology is helpless. The actual lesson is more serious and more useful. Digital resilience now has to be treated as part of national and regional resilience, not as a separate tech discipline that can be handled in isolation by IT departments. And that connects directly to what public reporting showed this week. AWS did not say the world ended. It did not say the internet collapsed. It did not describe a universal outage. Instead, the reporting and dashboard updates point to something much more credible and much more important. Physical hits created service disruption. AWS worked recovery. Customers were advised to shift where needed. And the event exposed how conflict can hit cloud infrastructure in ways many organizations intellectually understood but operationally underprepared for. That is a much stronger story than exaggeration because it is real. And it gets even more important when you remember where AWS sits inside the modern economy. This is not a niche hosting provider serving a handful of experimental startups. AWS supports governments, enterprises, media companies, universities, retailers, financial systems, and software products people use every day. Not every service in the region failed. Not every customer was hit equally. But when public reporting says key cloud facilities in a major region took direct or nearby physical damage, every serious operator in the world pays attention. Because they know what comes next. Audits, architecture reviews, migration plans, disaster recovery testing, risk committee meetings, new conversations about cross-region replication, tougher questions from customers and regulated industries, and a new appreciation for the fact that regional strategy is now inseparable from geopolitical strategy. That point is especially important in the Gulf because the region is not just a market, it is a hub. AWS opened its UAE region in 2022, and Amazon has publicly described the Middle East as a major growth area with continued investment across the region, including a large planned Saudi infrastructure region. That means this is not a side story in a peripheral market. It sits at the intersection of cloud expansion, AI infrastructure growth, digital transformation, and state-level technology strategy. When infrastructure in that environment gets hit, it sends a message far beyond the immediate damage report. The message is not stop building. The message is build with reality. Reality means multi-region planning, not just multi-zone planning. Reality means physically diverse recovery assumptions. Reality means understanding that redundancy inside one conflict-exposed corridor may not be enough. Reality means cybersecurity teams and physical security teams can no longer think in separate boxes. Reality means boards cannot treat geopolitical risk as something that matters only to oil companies and shipping firms. Reality means cloud customers need to know not only what services they use, but where and under what contingency assumptions. And there is one more layer people should not ignore. This incident also says something about the psychology of modern conflict. The goal of attacks like this is not always mass destruction. Sometimes the point is to force decision makers to widen their sense of exposure, to make states, firms, insurers, investors, and infrastructure operators feel that the perimeter of the conflict is larger than they hoped. If cloud infrastructure in the Gulf can be damaged, then the conflict is no longer just about military targets in the narrow sense. It is about the wider economic operating environment. That is why this story will likely outlast the immediate event. Even after repairs are completed and services normalize, the memory does not disappear. The lesson does not disappear. Every CTO, CIO, CISO, risk officer, cloud architect, and government technology official who watched this unfold just received the same brutal reminder. The future may be digital, but the infrastructure of that future is still made of things that can burn, flood, lose power, and go offline. That is not fear, that is planning. And the organizations that treat this as a planning lesson will come out of it stronger. They will diversify, they will test, they will simplify failover paths. They will challenge assumptions that looked fine on a slide deck but weaker in a crisis room. They will map dependencies more honestly. They will think about resilience the way power grids, ports, and telecom operators already have to think about it, as a whole system discipline. Because that is what the modern cloud has become. Not just a software story, a system story, a power story, a connectivity story, a logistics story, a geography story, and in moments like this, a security story. So yes, the hook is dramatic. A relatively cheap one-way drone helped knock high-value cloud infrastructure in the Gulf off balance. But the deeper point is not the contrast between cheap and expensive. It is the contrast between what people imagine the digital world to be and what it actually is. They imagine weightless permanence. What they actually built is an extraordinary but still physical civilization of servers, substations, cooling systems, fiber routes, and data halls spread across a world that remains unstable, contested, and very capable of reaching back. That is the real headline. The cloud did not disappear, but the illusion did. And once you see that, you start to understand why this moment matters so much. Because from this point on, nobody serious gets to talk about digital infrastructure as if it exists outside history, outside geography, or outside conflict. Not after this. Not after direct strikes, public service disruptions, rerouting advisories, energy shocks, tanker slowdowns, and a region-wide security crisis all collided in the same week. The screen in front of you may feel calm. The app may still load. The dashboard may eventually turn green again. But behind that apparent normality is the truth this week, forced into the open. Modern life depends on physical infrastructure in dangerous places, and the distance between a low-cost drone and a high-value digital system is now a lot smaller than most people wanted to believe. That is the warning. That is the mechanism. And that is what the smartest companies, governments, and operators in the world are studying right now. Not because the internet ended, but because the future just got more honest.